Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm your host, Cole. Joining me today is Jacob. Jacob, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Cole and Jacob back together again for the first time, just the two of us.
Back together again. I thought about doing some podcast without you, but it just didn't make any damn sense. It's like spaghetti without meatballs or gin without tonic. It's just insane and pointless, and I'm not going to do it. What kind of person drinks gin without tonic?
I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Cole.
Well, then let's move on it from it real quickly. Um, Quick note to listeners, as you know, we are a subscription-based company. So you can always buy a subscription at geopoliticalfutures.com. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. You can even follow us on Instagram. We've got a lot of really cool graphics and maps that we throw up there. So please come check us out. Every dollar matters. Now, Jacob, I want to talk real quickly. The day we're recording this, what is today? Today is Wednesday the 19th, correct?
Yes, all day.
So, all right. So far, so good. We are one for one. Let's talk a little bit about Syria real quick before we really get into this. The big announcement, I think everybody knows by now, is that the United States said it was going to totally withdraw its forces from Syria. Now, there's a lot. There's a little bit of confusion. I think some miscommunications. It was announced, and subsequently, I think I saw national security writer for the Daily Beast, Spencer Ackerman, said that maybe it won't be a total withdrawal. But either way, the message is kind of sent, right? This kind of hangs the curds out to dry a little bit. This is the United States sort of disengaging from the region and turning things over to Turkey. But I think more interesting than that are sort of the corroborating pieces of evidence that show that it might be happening, and the resolving of differences between Turkey and the U.S. Yeah.
Oh, I don't think the differences are fully resolved. I think you're right to say that the headline here is not so much the U.S. is withdrawing from Syria as it is to say the U.S., as we expected and said 2 years ago, is basically abandoning the Kurds. And I think you're right that they're doing that for the benefit of a stronger relationship with Turkey. But I think if we've learned anything about the Middle East, it's that nothing is permanent. So that the United States and Turkey are now, they seem to be on again, off again. Right now, they're on again. Don't think for a minute that current accommodation is going to be permanent. All of these things depend on things that are happening on the ground.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of talk about some of this committee, right, to try and politically resolve some of the differences in the Syrian civil war, and it's going to be constituted by some Assad government people and some Syrian rebel people, and then a bunch of people from Iran and Russia, and I don't remember, maybe Turkey. But it's going to get kind of strange, kind of quickly. And it's going to be interesting to see, I think, too, whether Turkey is up to the task, right? Because now, if the U.S. is going to rely more on Turkey, it's got to take on Syria and Russia and Iran and the Islamic State. And I don't mean take on as in a fight, but just sort of like those are the things you have to deal with when you're in northeastern Syria.
So some of them you might have to fight. I mean, look, I don't know how many more times we have to be told that there is some kind of diplomatic outside solution to the Syrian civil war that's going to work. I can tell you that I was in Moscow last week, and we might have a separate podcast on what I was doing out on the road for the past couple of weeks. Readers and listeners might have noticed that my writing volume has gone down the last 3 weeks. But there was a Russian company that presented their forecast at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and they said that it was going to be a peaceful year in Syria. I sort of said, what on earth are you talking about?
This is the same Syria?
It goes to show you the Russians want to have something for their intervention. They want to have something to show for their intervention. So they are interested in solidifying Assad going forward. I don't think they care exactly what those borders look like as long as they're defensible for Assad. So honestly, I think that between Turkey and Iran and Russia, there are some things to work out, and they will have to work them out. But one of the big stumbling blocks here is that the United States was sitting right there in the middle of it all. And now the United States is saying that it's pulling out. And I can't help but think two things. First of all, as you said, this was obviously a decision from the top. This was obviously President Donald Trump woke up this morning and decided this was what needed to happen, to the surprise of some of his own staff and some of his own bureaucracy. I make no value judgment on that. I think there's a time and a place for everything. But certainly there were some apparently inside the State Department, inside the White House, who were surprised by this move. And that just that's part of Trump's style of kind of shooting from the hip. The second thing is, that's going to get a lot of press, and the Syrian Kurds are going to get a lot of press. But I also can't help but think 6, 8 months ago, I think we were here talking, and we were talking about how the United States was putting more military advisors, quote unquote, on the ground in Syria. And a little part of you had to think, well, that's how it started in Vietnam too. I can't help but think, what if John F. Kennedy had woken up one morning and said, we're getting the heck out of Vietnam? Like, take them all out. I don't care. Get everybody out. I can't help but think that this is a kind of moment where the United States is looking at the board and saying, look, ISIS is basically defeated. The United States has better things to be doing with its time than committing its blood and its treasure to a Middle East situation that has no benefit for it.
Well, man, I'd be remiss not to point out that yes, while your writing volume on our website has decreased, your Twitter meltdowns on your airlines has dramatically shot up. We don't really need to get into that, but I had a few nice little laughs over that, huh?
I will limit myself to just saying that I will no longer be flying KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines. And if anybody cares what I think about that, feel free to let that impact your own decisions.
Well, for what it's worth, I do not care. I think you should have driven. You should just drive to Russia. Like, problem solved.
Yeah, that one problem solved, but a host of others created.
Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the real reason we're here. We are here to talk about our 2019 forecast. Now, for readers or listeners rather who are unfamiliar with this, I'll explain it very briefly. We do a forecast every single year that says this is what to watch out for in the next year. These are the trends that are going to kind of define and shape the geopolitical landscape, and we accompany those with predictions of what we think will happen. We are frequently right. We are not always right, but it's more important, even indispensable, as sort of our guiding framework, from which we work. Now, if you are familiar with some of our prior forecasts, I do want to make one little note about formatting. And I know I'm like stopping this podcast like dead in its tracks, talking about like the structures of documents before we get into it. But it's an important distinction. We study geopolitics. Because we do that, there has been sort of a natural inclination to structure these forecasts on a region by region basis. So we would say, here's Russia, and that's what's going to happen in Russia, and here's East Asia, and here's what's going to happen in East Asia, and so on and so forth. But I was thinking about it, and I don't think that format really made a lot of sense, right? And I don't want to belabor the point too much because I know we need to get into it. But I just want to say, Jacob, that like we don't care as much about China, the country. To understand the international system, you need to have a very strong understanding of the country of China. But if you want to really get down to brass tacks, it's not so much China that is shaping the international system. It's these various things that China is doing and how these other countries are responding to that. And it's a subtle point, but it's important. And we've kind of inverted our forecast accordingly, to kind of reflect these trends and to reflect the things that are actually going to happen this year, and not just this country will do this, China will do this, the European will do that. There are a lot of pitfalls of doing it that way. One of them is that it got really repetitive and it got really boring. And sometimes there were just things that we were obligated to say that we didn't even really want to say. And you saw that sometimes, when we talk about South America or sub-Saharan Africa. No disrespect to any of these countries, but Paraguay and the Democratic Republic of Congo don't necessarily shape the international system in the ways that the European Union's dissolution might. So we want to focus on the themes and less about the regions, and we talk about all the different regions accordingly. Jacob, is that a satisfactory explanation of how this kind of worked out this year?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I would just emphasize the point that, and this was true before globalization, but certainly in our world in the 21st century, nothing that happens in one area is not connected to something that's going to happen in another area. And it's too easy to sort of create, okay, here's East Asia and here's Middle East, and we're going to create forecasts about each one of these. The thing that is different about geopolitics, and one of the things that I think we often add to the discussion, is understand how this thing in Syria connects to this thing in Shanghai, connects to this thing in Sydney, and understand how this is all part of the same fabric rather than that these are discrete things.
Yeah, it doesn't really make any sense to talk about the Syrian civil war as a uniquely Middle Eastern development. You've got everybody in there now, so let's talk about the center of gravity that is the Syrian civil war and go from there, rather than talk about Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war in the Russia section, and then the United States's and Turkey's and Syria's and so forth and so on. So,
Yeah.
without further ado, let's get into this. Now, I said that we divided this up into a few main thematic sections rather than regional sections, and I want to go through each of those four. We're going to list them out right now, and then we're going to get really into it. Now, the first one is basically talking about the end of this expansionary business cycle. Right, you're starting to see some economies or economic growth slow. Some are contracting even, and that's going to be a big thing to watch in the world ahead. The next is the race for power in the periphery, where you see a lot of other nations start to be a little bit more active than they once were. The next section involves European disunion, and the last one is all about the Middle East, but it's defined not by the Middle East, but the coalition that has formed to block Iran's advances. So we're gonna get into all of these. So let's start at the top, Jacob. Let's talk about the end of a business cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it. And I also just want to say, both for subscribers and people who might be subscribers, we'll confine, I think, our discussion here to the big forces and the big thematic issues. There are a number of discrete forecasts that come out of those forces. And for the most part, we will leave those in the document. You'll have to read it to get to the precise ways that these forecasts are going to manifest in the world, but we're still going to talk about these forces and give you a sense of kind of what you can expect. And
so, yeah, I think the marketing people might actually murder us if we gave away for free everything that we actually make people pay for. So we do need to truncate it a little bit.
yeah, for sure. And then the only other thing I would say is that, are we allowed to spoil the title, Cole? Are we allowed to tell the people what the title is?
Oh no, I think it's wildly appropriate to tell them what the title is. The title is "The World in 2019: A Year on the Edge."
Yeah, and I think that leads really nicely into a discussion of that first section that you talked about, which is this end of a global economic cycle. And I would say it's an end of a cycle in two distinct ways. It's the end of a much longer economic cycle that really begins with, I don't want to call it the alliance, let's call it the pragmatic restoration of ties between China and the United States in the 1970s.
That is a wow. It's a what a much simpler way to put that. Good.
Yeah, well, I'm the king of simplicity. But if there is a complicated way to say something, I will find it. Don't you worry. This goes back to the United States and China both fearing the Soviet Union more than they feared each other and deciding that they were going to make common cause. And a couple of years after Nixon goes to China and relationships improve, Chairman Mao dies and Deng Xiaoping takes over. And what does Deng Xiaoping say? Deng Xiaoping says that it is time for China to enrich itself, that it is glorious for China to enrich itself, which is amazing, right? A communist country, the Communist Party of China, endorses enriching yourself as the key glory. Now, the way that China enriches itself is it uses its massive population to basically become the world's factory. It starts to build goods way cheaper than anybody else can build them, and that's their competitive advantage. The reason that people like you and me can buy iPhones for the price that we can buy them at is because cheap Chinese labor is making them. And that's not true just of iPhones, it's true of everything from shoes to furniture to things you can't imagine. The United States' role in this was to be the biggest consumer. And while a lot of US industries were decimated and millions of US jobs, it's hard to know exactly how many, but we can say millions of US jobs were lost due to this shift in global trade, US consumers got to buy cheap Chinese goods, and things that were before much more expensive or might have been more expensive to develop became much cheaper. Now, the problem with all this is that China's advantage, as I said, was this cheap labor. And the problem with using cheap labor is that the moment that you start getting success, you're already unraveling your own success, right? Because the better that China does, the more it has to pay its workers. And the more you have to pay your workers, the more the profit margins are going to be reduced. And the issue here is that China, instead of using that wealth and instead of using that money to invest in new companies or to go up the value chain or to take risks, in developing new sectors, a lot of Chinese companies borrowed money from the Chinese government in order to pay workers the salaries that they had to pay them in order to continue working. And I have called this basically a Ponzi scheme, you're getting companies that are becoming less profitable, and their edge is becoming less sharp, and they're just borrowing so that they can continue to pay people more and more. And then China has some non-performing loans, and then it sweeps it under the table, and it just does the whole process again. And that gets us to the point that we're at today, because the world economy for the past, call it 20, 25 years, has been about China being this massive producer of cheap goods or different types of electronics, the US consuming it, and everybody else also trying to rely on their export basis too. And the problem is that this system doesn't work anymore, in large part because demand is a little bit maxed out. There aren't as many people who need to buy all the things that are being made, because China wasn't the only one relying on exports. You had Germany, you had Japan, you had all these countries that were producing beyond what their domestic bases could actually metabolize. And we've reached the point where their usual markets abroad have also begun to slow. And you can see that in the way that production is outpacing demand.
But these things are never purely economic, right? And I'm thinking not exclusively about the 2008 financial crisis, but that was like a huge catalyst for some of these things. So I guess my question would be, what are some of the political implications of these economic downturns?
Well, you're right that it's never economic, because you wouldn't have had this sort of global system of trade develop unless China and the United States had gotten together in the 1970s and 80s. This all comes from that alliance, if you will, between China and the United States. The second point you make is also important, because that is the second cycle I was talking about, which is to say the 2008 financial crisis laid some of these issues bare. It was the first moment where, when you looked around, you could see the irrationality that had been embedded within the system. And since 2008, the global economy has been in what I would call a pretty weak and tepid recovery that has been dependent on very, very low interest rates and stimulus out the wazoo in China, very easy monetary policy across the world. And now you're reaching the end of that economic cycle. And this is it's a cyclical cycle. That's a great
Sure.
thing. It's
Yeah, there's only so much money you can print, and only so much quantitative easing you can kind of employ, right?
Well, yeah, and you go through these cycles. Like the United States has, it's almost the longest the United States has gone in its entire existence without hitting a recession. I think there are only two other periods in U.S. history that are even close. And these things are not catastrophic. These things are not cataclysmic. They happen sometimes. And one of the issues is you have the United States reaching the end stage of its economic cycle and looking at a recession on the horizon. You've got that happening in Germany. You've got that happening in a couple other economies. The problem is, and it's twofold. Number one, it's happening at the same time that you're getting the end of that much longer economic cycle that I described between the United States and China. And the second is that the way that the global economy has recovered and been structured since 2008 has not been to solve the underlying problems that led to 2008. If you look around the world, there is so much debt out there right now, even in the midst of a very long economic recovery, that it makes you worry that if there is going to be a cyclical downturn, there might be sectors or debt bubbles that we don't even know about yet that are going to pop, because people have been looking for places to park their money, in part because interest rates have been so low. And that's when you start to worry that you've had inflation of value in some of these asset classes that didn't actually correspond to what their value will be once the global trend line is not overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah, and I think a good example too of how these economic and political issues sort of bleed into each other is that the obvious one is the trade war, right? The U.S.-China trade war, or whatever you want to call it. I know it's a rote thing, but let's roll with it. It's not it's not a purely economic matter, right? It's certainly not a purely economic matter. This is in large part a strategic consideration, right? It's one of the reasons too that the U.S. membership or former membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership was sort of like crossed all these weird ideological lines because you had people who favored like high trade and global trade, and you had isolationists and you had all these other people, but at the same time there were people who wanted to use TPP as sort of a cudgel, as a tool to combat China strategically, not just economically. And now we have a whole lot of trade tariffs that are accomplishing that as well. I'm not saying it's not economic at all, but these things get really muddled really quickly. Yeah.
No, it's so political, and everybody's been calling it the China trade war. And I have an idea for a piece, and I just haven't written it yet. It's one of the things I want to write now that I'm back from my travels, and I'm beginning to call it the third opium war. And the reason I'm doing that is, I thought you might
That's
like
funny.
that.
I,
But
I
the
think too.
the reason I'm calling it that, and I don't want to spend too much time in history, but just like let's do 60 seconds on what the first and second opium wars were, right?
I will time you.
Okay, let's see if I can actually do it in 60 seconds. The the reason the first opium war was fought was this. China had lots of things like silk and porcelain that Europe wanted to buy, right? So Europe is spending all of its silver, a lot of it coming from the New World, to buy porcelain, silk, other things from China. A massive trade deficit comes up where China's getting all the silver and the European states are losing all the silver. What do the Europeans do? They realize that the Chinese want to buy opium from them. So the British take the lead and they go into India and they sell opium into the Chinese market. So the silver is coming into China, but then Chinese people are using the silver to buy opium and it's going back into the British Empire. The first opium war starts because China says no more. We are outlawing opium trade. Our population is becoming junkies, and this economic relationship is not working for us anymore. And the British Empire, with some of their, well, let's not call them friends, but some of their partners in arms, says, "Huh, you and whose army?" And they open up China and they say, no, you're gonna buy whatever we want you to buy, and you're gonna give us these trade concessions because you guys can't resist us, right? That is the first and second opium wars in a nutshell. And that is what brings down the Qing Empire, because China is basically embarrassed on the world stage and can't defend itself from these European powers. What's happening right now with the United States and China? As I said, one of the issues here is that there's just not enough consumers in the world for the goods that are out there. What is China more than anything now that it has become a much more well developed and a much richer society? It's a billion potential consumers. And what's happening now is the United States is basically saying, look, China got rich off of being a factory for all these goods, and lots of millions of American jobs were lost and all these other things. Now the US wants to sell to the Chinese market. And the Europeans want to sell to the Chinese market, and they don't want to have to compete with the Chinese companies. The Chinese, on the other hand, they're trying to do the exact opposite. They are trying to disconnect themselves from this dependence on exports, and they want their companies to sell to their own consumers. That's why Xi Jinping is talking about self reliance all the time. He wants Chinese
Right.
companies to sell to Chinese consumers. And you're exactly right. The TPP is a free trade agreement that was designed to try and limit China. The tariffs are the same thing. I've been jokingly referring to it. It's hallows, not horcruxes. You're still going for the same thing here. You're still going
Oh
for
my God.
opening up the Chinese economy. And yes, I did. I just went Harry Potter, and Cole's mind just
Yeah,
blew
I
up
was
on the
gonna try
computer
and
screen.
gloss over that. Maybe convince you to kill that and edit, but
No, it's such a
it's
beautiful
fine. We can
metaphor.
oh,
No, it is. And it goes back to the witchcraft conversation we had a month ago when we were last here, remember?
that's true. We did do that. We did do that. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, that's on me. I opened up that can of worms. I'll take responsibility for that one.
But in all seriousness, that's what's going on here. The United States is trying to open up the Chinese market so that the United States has preferential treatments, and the Chinese are trying to resist as much as possible, because it's not the type of situation where they don't have the technology to resist the US Navy from coming in and forcibly selling Starbucks and iPhones to Chinese people, right? But it's the same type thing. China wants control. China wants independence. China does not want to be at the whims of the global economy or any global power. And that's the whole reason the Chinese Communist Party is there. They were the best suited for resisting foreign invaders during the 1930s and the 1940s. That was why Mao won. That is why the Chinese communists are there. If they can't resist, the whole edifice sort of crumbles. So that's how the end of these economic cycles meets this political quote unquote trade war. And that's why all of this is coming to a head.
Yeah, that's going to be a big one to watch in 2019. And there's I don't want to give too much away or anything like that, but suffice it to say, when when growth slows, and even worse when economies contract, there are usually some social and political consequences to that. And each country is going to kind of respond in their own way. Um, but let's move on to the second section. This one's super interesting. It's a much larger one. It's a bit broader. So I want to kind of give it, really give it its due in this episode of the podcast. We're calling it the race for power in the periphery. It's our take on something you do see in some other media outlets. A lot of people are sort of emphasizing this quote unquote return to great power politics, and I say quote unquote, but it's true and it's not. I think people, and I think you probably agree, Jacob, are overestimating how badly the United States has fallen in the international system and how weak it is compared to some other nations. That's probably overstated. Um, but it is true that the United States that gap between them is narrowing a little bit, and that the United States is kind of stretching itself a little thinner than it normally is, which is why it's trying to disengage from places like the Middle East, as we talked about at the top of the episode. Um, so it's just kind of a long way of saying the US knows it's stretching itself too thin. Some other countries are kind of being opportunistic in these really interesting places of the world. We're kind of generically calling it the periphery, but it's all these kind of estuarial places where that don't fit too neatly into one specific sphere of influence, right?
I have seen so you were right, but I want to pick on something you said and really emphasize it. Anybody who believes that this is the return of great power politics must have thought that the end of history was a real thing. Great power politics hasn't gone anywhere. It never went anywhere. Anybody who thought that it went somewhere was really in a fantasy land. I don't think it is the return of great power politics because I don't think it went anywhere, and I don't think the great powers stopped competing. Furthermore, I think to really make that case, anybody who thinks that we're in an era of great power competition, what they are really talking about there is they're saying we're moving to a multipolar world. And I'm on record as saying we're not in a multipolar world. And the reason I say this is because if you're talking about a multipolar world, that means you're talking about poles of power throughout the world that are at least somewhat equal, where there is some parity, right? That's just not the case. The United States is far more powerful from an economic perspective, from a military perspective, I would also argue from a political perspective, than anywhere else in the world. That is not to say that there aren't other nodes of power. Certainly, between China and Japan, you have a major node of power in the world. Russia is a very formidable power. The European Union, especially economically, is a formidable power. There are others throughout the world, but no one of these are equal to the United States. And even in combination, a lot of, or at least in the combinations that can credibly be imagined, you're not talking about anybody who's going to be able to take on the United States one on one. That said, and you said it, and I just want to emphasize it, what is happening is that the United States has overextended itself. And this is a classic thing that the United States does in foreign policy. It ping pongs back and forth between trying to be too hands off and then not being able to define its goals. So if you look at what the United States is trying to do, the United States has articulated it very clearly. It wants to end China's rise and open up its markets. It wants to stop Russia from expanding into the borderlands and weaken it. It wants to basically have regime change in Iran, prevent North Korea from getting nuclear weapons. And by the way, we're going to wrap up the war on jihadism and terror and fix everything there.
Oh yeah, that's it.
I don't care how powerful you are. You can't do all that. It's just simply not possible. And so when we say there's a race for power in the periphery, we are not saying that countries like China or Russia are equal to the United States in power or can even pretend to be. What we are saying is that the United States is overextended and that it is trying right now to create new relationships and new alliances to manage all these different problems, but those are not set in stone yet. And you have opportunistic powers. Some of them are China and Russia, but a lot of them are actually regional powers that see an opportunity to increase their strength and increase their power in different regions. So one of the regions that we're looking at is Central Asia. Central Asia, if you're a geopolitics junkie, is the heartland of the world in Mackinder's theory. Right here, you have Kazakhstan, which has been sort of the regional heavyweight for a while, and yet all of a sudden you have Uzbekistan emerging, the most populous nation in the region, with a lot of the most important strategic geography in the region, and now reforming itself politically, and looks to me like they're going to come into somewhat of a, let's not call it a clash because it's not quite there yet, but you're going to see an emerging rivalry between those powers. You've got Australia asserting itself in the South Pacific. You've got Brazil with a brand new, let's call him a populist president, talking about completely reorganizing Brazil's relationship and projecting a lot more Brazilian power in South America. Those are some of the reasons that are first on our mind, but anywhere you look in the world, you're getting the sense that the United States is so busy with so many things at the moment that the United States turns to put out one fire, you see stuff happening in another part of the world because nobody's really watching.
Yeah, and it's an overly simplistic view of these things too, because it's not, these countries aren't doing this like without the United States' knowledge. Like sometimes they're doing it, I don't want to say with this explicit encouragement or at the behest of the United States, but sometimes it is kind of in that case. I mean, like you've got the Quad, uh, working. That's sorry, India, Australia, Japan, the United States, and it's very, 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 very early form, kind of trying to like hem China in a little bit as well, and that's partly like the U.S. is doing, um, and the U.S. may co-opt some of these things, and or they may try to counter them, but this is not. This is not happening without the United States' knowledge, and the United States has some agency here, and it can kind of use this to its advantage or combat it as it sees fit. So that's what we mean when we say competition. It's not that it's not that there's like these usurpers coming up that are going to dislodge the United States. That's just like fantasy.
Yeah, and it's not even that we're headed towards some kind of third world war. I'm not going to discount the possibility that one day in the future there might be some kind of world conflict, but I think we're many years away from that sort of thing. What we have right now is, look, the United States is basically at the zenith of its power. It's become very strong, and the problem there is that it has overextended itself and it's not able it is it's funny. The United States often has trouble defining what its goals are. The United States has defined what its goals are now. It's very clear what its goals are. Now it has to engage in prioritization. And that's a whole different other challenge. And it's one that is extremely difficult. You can see it playing out just in the first year or two of the Trump administration, right? Like, what was the top thing that the United States wanted to do in the Middle East when Trump came to power? Destroy and annihilate the Islamic State. What happens after you destroy and annihilate the Islamic State? Well, there is a security vacuum, and Iran pushes itself right into that vacuum, right? Because things aren't just going to stay completely all over the place. Iran's going to try and push itself in. And then US foreign policy becomes completely reactive and says, oh, okay, now the United States must hit Iran. It's one of the characteristics of US strategic thinking. And I also think one of the results of its power compared to a lot of other countries, that it thinks reactively in general. The United States is not often planning its move 5, 10 years down the road. It's seeing what's in front of it and it's trying to play a game of whack a mole.
I think really interesting too, and I don't want to get too into it, but Central America is another one of these places that we consider on the periphery. It's and it's not just migration, right? China is the big boogeyman, and we keep coming back to this point a lot. But China's the boogeyman, and it's got the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically just a public works project to get rid of steel and laborers. But you've got China investing money into Latin America all of a sudden, and like all of a sudden, people are freaking out about it. But it's not really all of a sudden. They've been doing this for a while, and they've put some assets in places like Venezuela and Panama. Um, but it's a really interesting, I think, development, and something that you've brought up. It's sort of like we forget about the Monroe Doctrine because the United States achieved it so long ago, but like the Monroe Doctrine, it's relevant again. It was just super interesting to me.
Look, it is. And again, we're at a very early stage here, but like you said, it's not really a migration issue anymore. The United States really hasn't paid that much attention to its near abroad because it hasn't really had to.
What have hadn't had it to? Yeah, it doesn't have to.
And if you're looking for potential weaknesses in the United States, one of them happens to be that a lot of these governments, in part because of U.S., you want to call it interference, you want to call it competition with the Soviets. I mean, the United States has a checkered history in both Central America and South America, and a lot of these governments here are very unstable, in part due to the previous bout of sort of United States versus United States versus the Soviet Union in the Cold War. I don't think we're anywhere close to that point yet, but I think we are at the point where you have to consider that the United States is going to have to look at Central America, even South America, as potential places that rivals could try to forge different relationships that could pose problems to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit, only to say I don't think the history. Well, I would say two things. One, I don't think the history is especially checkered. I think the history is actually very, very, very consistent until recently, which is that in Central America, especially in some of these like Caribbean, trading routes through the Gulf of Mexico into the Atlantic, things like that, no power can be established that is not the United States. It's a little different in South America, but I would just say it's been a remarkably consistent part of U.S. foreign policy, and that kind of dovetails to the second thing I would say is that that's not a partisan issue. That has been a key feature in U.S. foreign policy since Thomas Jefferson started writing about foreign policy in the 1780s. So it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, but I think one of the interesting things to point out is that I don't know that at any point in the US's history that there's been more, uh, let's call it economic power or political power in Central America and South America than there is today. I mean, Mexico, for all of its issues, is a major economy and it's a major country. Uh, Argentina is a basket case. Its economy just went into recession. But Argentina, again, you're talking about a major economy, major country. Brazil is the same way. It's not, it's not the 1800s anymore. The New World countries and the heirs of the Spanish Empire are strong in their own rights and are able to push around their own weight a little bit themselves. And then on top of that, you have countries abroad that look around at Central America and look around at South America and may see some kind of potential for whether it's economic benefit or political benefit. I don't think we're at the point yet where you have to worry about anything military, but if things continue to develop in this trend, this is one of the only ways that you can really affect U.S. national security if you can turn some of these countries around it.
Okay, so probably the last kind of arena we should talk about here. Um, Recent flare up, right? Just a couple weeks ago. It's died down a little bit, but you actually probably have some really unique insight into this, considering your travels into Russia and Moscow and what have you over the past couple weeks. But it's not that long ago that the Kerch Strait incident took place, and it's just a very timely reminder before the end of the year that, like Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine, and to a smaller degree Belarus, but let's focus on Ukraine, is going to be one of these hotspots, and this is one of those areas where Russia and the West sort of butt heads all the time. I mean, it's still a divided nation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm worried about what's going on in Ukraine. They have elections coming up in March, and I don't think I have to remind our listeners what happened the last time Ukraine had elections in 2014. But if you were under a rock or don't remember, you had a revolution that brought down the pro-Russian leader, and you had the Russia go in with its little green men, and you had Crimea. Everything that we're dealing with today in Ukraine goes back to that moment in 2014. You have elections coming up again. You have basically no party that looks like it's even going to garner 25% of the vote, let alone a majority. You have an ongoing sort of frozen insurgency conflict in eastern Ukraine. You have Russia solidifying its control in Crimea. A lot of people have accused Russia of trying to sort of lay the groundwork for taking over eastern Ukraine. I think that really misreads Russia's intentions. I don't think Russia wants instability at all in Ukraine, but I also think that Russia knows Ukraine better than most in the West do. They see that it's an economic basket case. They see that the oligarchs who are running Ukraine might be politically compromised, and they are preparing for a scenario in which Ukraine unravels. And I would say the thing that worries me the most is they're not the only ones preparing. Uh, Poland is also preparing for that eventuality because there are parts of Ukraine where there are a large number of Poles who are living. The Hungarians also are preparing for Ukraine to unravel. There are parts of Ukraine, and they're small, but there are parts of Ukraine where a majority of the citizens are Hungarian. I'd say the same even for the Romanians, although less so. And I think what you have here is you just have a lot of different forces that are threatening to pull Ukraine apart. And there's no way that you can use geopolitics to predict the moment that something is going to unravel like that. But the way I keep thinking about it is I keep thinking about history and I keep thinking about Poland in the 18th century. The way that slowly over the course of a century, the powers that surrounded Poland slowly divvied up because Poland couldn't resist. I think when you look at Ukraine, you have to start worrying that that's the way that it's trending. What if Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk was just sort of the first partition? What if you're going to get Ukraine continue to unravel and you're going to get Russia making sure that it is able to take care of business in those areas where there are majority Russians? Maybe you'll get some kind of rump state that's based around Kiev and some other things around it. That's a very radical scenario. I'm not saying that's the way it's headed. I'm just saying when you look at the geopolitical forces that are on the board, they are all threatening to tear Ukraine apart. And when you add something like an election into a mix that is that volatile, you really have to take a look at it and say, okay, is this could this be a moment that all these forces are unleashed, or are all these forces there? Are they going to just continue to stay pent up and build more over time?
I think that sort of harkens back to a recurring theme that you'll see a lot in our forecast, which is that 2019, that ain't the year this is going to happen, right? This probably will not be the most consequential year. of this particular millennium or even this decade. Um, but it is going to be it's going to be the one that we're going to look back at someday and say, actually, this was a lot more important than we originally thought it was for the reasons that you just laid out.
Yeah, I mean, things tend to build up over time, and Ukraine just happens to be, I think, one of the most clear examples. But it's sometimes hard to sit down and try and forecast years where you think there's not going to be a lot of top level change. You have to identify those areas where there are underlying forces that are building up. And yeah, I think Ukraine is one of the most obvious where some of these forces are definitely beginning to build.
Okay, Jacob, I think we're going to stop there for today. We're about halfway through. We've got two other really, really good and really compelling sections that we are going to go over in part two of our forecast preview podcast. So, Jacob, I wanted to say thank you for taking the time. Listeners, thank you for taking the time. Remember, you can always go to geopoliticalfutures.com to check us out, peruse our site, look at us on social media, see what we're all about. And if you feel so inclined, you should buy yourself a subscription for Christmas. The forecast itself is going to publish next week sometime. Stay tuned for final dates on that. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.